Hello and welcome to Ethics in the News. My name's Hannah Storm and I'm the director of the Ethical Journalism Network. In this edition I'm speaking with Jo Healey. She's a senior BBC News journalist who developed and delivers trauma reporting training through the BBC Academy. Jo is the author of Trauma Reporting, a journalist's guide to covering sensitive stories. And I began by asking her what the motivation for writing the book was.
Well, the book evolved out of the training that I initiated within the BBC for hundreds of journalists around the fact that so many of us so regularly can be working so closely with people who are emotionally so very vulnerable and endlessly. Day in, day out, we're in the homes of people whose parents, whose children have sadly died, of people who've been sexually violated. And it became a kind of recognition initially from me just covering these stories across 3 decades, really, that should we be going into these homes without being more trauma-informed, more aware of what people are going through, and more, not just clued in, but also with skills in good practice, because these aren't taught. They're not taught generally at journalism school. So that led me to do the training, and the comments that I got back from reporters led me to writing the book. And one of the biggest comments was, we tell our stories best through the people they affect. And I applied that same practice when I built up and crafted the training and researched the training. So I went to parents, I went to survivors who'd all chosen to tell their stories to journalists and who spoke to lots of reporters at dreadful times in their lives. And I said, when you were talking to us, what helped, what harmed, what made you feel comfortable, what made you feel uncomfortable, what did you like, what did you not like? And I filmed them and their responses, which they've very generously given to help us do our jobs better. Actually, it was that testimony applied to each step of the reporting process makes all the difference. It's so powerful. So they give their take on being approached, on being interviewed, on being filmed with, on us writing their stories, writing about them and following up their stories. The book, like the training, follows the process of what we as journalists do. It involves testimony of families. It involves lots of testimony of experienced news correspondents, documentary makers, including Louis Theroux, who share their experience and expertise in handling sensitive stories.
When you spoke with the relatives, the people who were grieving, what were the key messages you got from them in terms of how journalists might better navigate that relationship with them?
They have such valuable insight. There's a wider body of research which my families also back up and validate. And this was done by the organisation Disaster Action. Now, they interviewed our scores of families who were caught up in or bereaved through disasters, nearly 30 disasters internationally. When they chose to work with journalists, when they chose to speak to us, what made that a positive experience? What was it that made all the difference? Now, they came up with 6 key factors, and if you can apply as a journalist these factors to the families that you're working with, you won't go far wrong. The 6 were honesty, being open, honest, transparent, decent and straight in the way that you work with people. Acknowledgement, the important sorry, I'm so sorry for what you're going through. Acknowledging what they're going through. Accuracy, really important this, to get your facts right. They won't mind you going back and checking facts, but they will mind if you get them wrong. It causes immense distress, particularly when people are going through these dreadful life situations. They haven't chosen to be in the public eye. Consent is another one. Managing their expectations. What are they agreeing to? What may be in the piece? How much may be used? Where may their pictures and clips pop up? They need to know, they need to understand that our material can go everywhere. Control is another of the key factors. How can we give these people, often disempowered through their grief, some sort of control over the way we're working with them. That's really important. And compassion was the final one. So under that, I would include sensitivity, respect, understanding, empathy. Sensitivity can be small things, as you know, as a bereaved mum told me. She found it so difficult when reporters would turn up at her house and they didn't know her son's name or his age, the basic facts. Not only did she find that offensive, but she clammed up. So it's lose on, you know, as a human being, and losing as a reporter as well. As a survivor of childhood rape, who also speaks on in the book and on the course, Melody, she shares how my personal space is really important. So be very careful if you're with your cameraman, maybe piling in and putting on a radio mic, fixing a radio mic to my clothing, allowing control so I understand what you're doing when you're filming with me. That's really important, because as she says, I had too many people telling me what to do without explanation, and it wasn't pleasant. As a child, I need you to explain to me, to involve me in the process, and clearly not to overwhelm. Again, you know, when you're trauma informed, you can appreciate the exhaustion that people feel.
So what has the reaction been from journalists to the training and to the book?
It's been, you never say humbling, it sounds an odd word, but actually it has. My biggest insecurity when I started out on this work was thinking, is this too obvious? What I've discovered from all the feedback forms from 800 or so journalists who've now attended the training is that it isn't obvious. And clearly from the discussions that we have, because we share experience, we share expertise, it appears to be massively valued. They love hearing back from the families. They love being able to share their own experience and expertise, and they also really value having specific guidance, specific advice. So sharing skills of good practice at each step of the reporting process. It is a vulnerable process for journalists as well as families, and to have guidance, to think, I'm on the right tack now, and this is a good way to respond, and this is perhaps not a good thing to say or not a good thing to do. What's good practice? What's bad practice? Other professionals have this practice. Other professionals have this training, and it's long overdue that journalists are brought into a more professional arena when we're working with these vulnerable people.
We don't get this kind of training as journalists so much of the time, and to be able to find ways to sensitively respect and build relationships with really, really instrumental people to our story reporting is so crucial.
There's an awful lot of interest growing in this now, which is wonderful, because we do need to be getting out there and sharing this training with journalists all over the place, because there is, I now know, a real appetite and there is a need. I firmly believe, and I'm a powerful advocate for this, should be embedded in student learning internationally. It should just be a part of their course, because the way you interview someone sensitively is a world apart from the way students can be taught about incisive, challenging, interrogative interviewing, and all of that wholly appropriate with people who are disempowered through grief or through trauma or distress.
So what has the reaction been from families who have been bereaved and the people with whom you've built relationships over time to the training? And have you seen the work that you have taught and shared make a difference in some way?
Do you know what I have? I've seen a shift in attitude, a shift in expectation with journalists when treating people as people rather than a commodity, but also a real will to be more respectful, to be professional and kind. So there is a shift, I hope, that certainly I'm sensing, and I've been a journalist for a long, long time. Things are different now, and I think the current situation is helping to move that forward as well. And we are so much more accountable. Bad behaviour that once would have gone under the radar, we are being held to account now through social media, through all sorts of arena, and rightly so. But Just to mention the families, they are my inspiration in all of this, and they are absolutely at the heart of this work. They don't have a collective voice. The only common denominator of all the people I've interviewed, all the people you've interviewed, Hannah, is you. So there is a responsibility that we who are at the front line doing these interviews make that relationship professional and important, and reflect back the importance of that bond of trust to our editors and our producers back at base. But I'm bowled over, frankly, by the generosity of the families who take part in this work, who share, who are prepared to revisit these dreadful times in their lives and share how they interacted with journalists and what they liked and what they didn't like. Because, wow, how generous is that, just to help us do our jobs better, and also to help other families in the future who go through these terrible experiences but want to share them publicly for a whole host of reasons.
Working with people who are grieving always requires sensitive handling, but what are the additional considerations when interviewing people remotely who have been bereaved through COVID-19?
All of this is uncharted territory, isn't it? Then for the first time, we are interviewing people regularly who have been bereaved through this dreadful virus on laptops, and we're not with them. So there are certain things around their trauma and their grief which really need to be thought about. For instance, they're in isolation or in semi-isolation. They're not getting the normal things that you would get around a bereavement, like hugs, cards, flowers, cups of tea with the family. There isn't the emotional scaffolding that would normally be there to comfort you in the early days. It's contagious, so it's quite likely that the person that they've lost died alone, and that can bring up all sorts of feelings of guilt, shame, anger, disbelief, frustration. The funeral isn't what it should have been. Difficult to plan, difficult to organise, only a handful of people there. They can't get away from talk of the virus because it's all around, everybody's talking about it, and yet it's the thing that killed the member of their family. They've lost a person, they've lost the mum, the dad, the child, not a statistic. And there can be this fear, this anxiety that someone else near them is going to die, and this can add to a kind of a hypervigilance. So things that I think are perhaps important to consider are often their communication from the hospital. Little things like, that'll probably be a withheld number. Even being informed of the death by the hospital will be a withheld number. So avoid using your office phone, which also is likely to be a withheld number. It can just be a gut punch. Use your mobile. Acknowledging their grief, which is good practice anyway, as I was saying earlier, and being prepared, be clear and honest with them about what you'd like to do. Checking the facts, we talked about accuracy earlier, but also the importance of building rapport, bridging that sense of separation, but not doing it by chatting about the virus. The interview's about them, so think about them, not you and your opinions. And always remembering that people react to trauma in any number of ways. Some people are more technically savvy than others. Be patient with that. Explain the process. It may be worth just flagging up to them at this early stage to maybe not sit in front of a window for the interview. So you're not kind of shifting them around once you've linked up and they're on camera, and that's just awkward for them. So just explaining again little things about the process so that they're comfortable and they can ask questions. People who want to talk to us can be amazingly cooperative, I find, in these, and amenable and to what the strange requests that we have of them. And again, it's being very careful with that. If you've got technical people involved in the link up, just make them aware that this is a contributor that needs sensitive handling. It's not just any old interview that they're linking up to. Try and use a system where they can see you. And some systems they can't, if they're talking straight down the barrel of a camera to a studio, for instance. That needs careful handling. It's really hard on them to do interviews like that if they can't see the other person. If they can see you, then obviously use empathetic body language, eye contact, nodding, listening carefully, giving them time, not hurrying them. And also check that they're not sitting somewhere in front of something that could be embarrassing or distracting. Interview them with short, simple, open questions. Again, this sense of distance, you can lose long, involved questions. Remember that you're not there to hold them to account, you're there to hear their accounts. So avoid any kind of challenging why questions. Don't provoke emotional responses that cattle prod. How did you feel? You aren't with them to cope with the emotional fallout. And, that's crucial. You're not alongside them. You're not there to ease them through the process. Avoid saying, I know how you feel. You don't. And this sort of, again, this sense of distance, these things like that can hang in the air and just feel more insulting and more likely to make them clam up. Trauma's exhausting. Make allowances for this. And also, they need to know you're human, you look electronic, you're at the other side of a line, but actually, please be extra careful to be human, sensitive, respectful and attentive to them. If you've taken them to distressing memories and they are distressed, this gear change has to be handled carefully, but try to gently bring them into the here and now before you leave them. If they break down or if they're upset, check they've got someone either with them or someone that they can call. Again, we talked about managing expectations. This all-important sense of control. How's the material going to be used? Remember, they're in isolation, they talk, and then there's this void. So when you leave them, thank them, take your time, don't just cut off. That can be a very deadening experience, this sudden cutting off of technology. So ring them afterwards, have a chat with them. Are you okay with everything? And also once the piece is aired, this is advice I give anyway, but once the piece is aired, just take that extra couple of minutes to get back in touch. It may be by WhatsApp or text or by phone, whichever, or email, whichever way, but give them that channel to be able to talk to you about the experience, because they're on their own and they've just given you an awful lot of what they're feeling, and sometimes in a very odd space, and you do need to cushion that and be there for them beforehand, during and afterwards.
To what extent do journalists need to bear in mind the toll that this kind of work might take on their own mental health?
That's such an important point. I mean, many of us are isolating too. We don't have the newsroom, other colleagues sometimes to talk to about this. But in this situation, you're not the person who's experienced the massive trauma, but be aware that it impacts on you. And if you find that you're a bit sadder, you're a bit teary, you're a bit irritable, a bit reactive, or you're avoiding and withdrawing, there are all sorts of little ways in which this can manifest. And just track it back to when you've been doing these interviews. And let's face it, some of us, myself included, can relentlessly cover these stories, and you really need to be mindful that you look after yourself. And the biggest form of support is peer support by a long chalk, and it's talking to someone that you trust, that you respect their view, that understands soon after you've done the interview. And sometimes that's all that you need. Get it out there on the day. Talk about it, share it, encourage your colleagues to do the same. Approach them, say, God, that looked like a tough one. How did you get on? What was that like? Just encourage other people to talk about it too. And that will make a big difference. But do be mindful of your own health in all of this. Look after your interviewee, look after yourself, and look after each other.
And that was Jo Healey speaking with me.